So I'm here with Phil Gorski, a professor of sociology and religious studies at Yale University, and we have been together at a consultation on the theology of joy as a transformative movement. It's been an interesting conversation with colleagues, and it's great to have a chance to put some specific questions to you, Phil. We've talked, and one of the things that was hard is we talked about studying joy and how do we go about kind of catalyzing the study of joy in ways that are academically rigorous and kind of relevant to the academy and to the social need. It was almost inevitable to just kind of deal with what is joy exactly? What are we talking about? When you think about that question, what is joy? How do you answer it?
So the first thing to say is that there are a number of different kinds of joy. That's become very clear to me through the course of our conversations over the weekend. I would, for example, distinguish between the joy of the once born and the joy of the twice born. By the joy of the once born, I mean the joy of the young child encountering something new and fascinating for the very first time. And of course, we can experience that joy even into late age as we travel or meet new people or encounter new experiences or cultures. But there's also the joy of the twice born, which comes from a sense of the sort of plenitude, the goodness, the complexity of the world, and an acceptance of that in relationship to our own finitude and mortality. And that is perhaps also a kind of joy that can be experienced by some precocious young people at certain moments. And a distinction between once born and twice born, I simply mean the degree of awareness of one's own limitations, of the boundaries of the self, of one's own potentialities. I think another important distinction might be between individual and collective joy. Individual joy is, for example, the joy that we might experience in the course of a long hike to the top of a mountain, and then we finally reach the summit, and we look out over this large landscape, and we have the sense of mastery, the sense of accomplishment, the sense of effort that has brought us to that experience and opened up a certain kind of vista and a certain moment of tranquility and contemplativeness. But there's also collective joy, of course. This is joy that we experience with family or in a faith community or in a political rally and many different other contexts. And this is a joy that comes from a sense of unity, from a sense of shared purpose, from a sense of shared attention, and which opens up a sense of the possibilities, the solidarity and communitas and fraternity that lifts us out of the smallness of our own concerns. That said, I think it's also important to distinguish joy from a couple of other closely related feelings that we might have. So one would be the sense of ecstasy. And ecstasy, one example we talked about a great deal in our consultation would be the feeling that one might have had as a participant in a Nazi rally in Germany in 1938. Certainly there would have been a lot of the same sense of unity, the sense of fraternity, and so on and so forth. And so we talked a lot about how you would distinguish that from joy in the former sense. And this how I would make that distinction is that ecstasy involves a dissolution of the boundaries of the self, being swept up into a larger collectivity, and imagining this as a sort of an expansive collectivity, which is going to sort of encompass and swallow up everything around it. Quite literally, in the case of a military conquest. So I think that's one very important distinction to make. There may have been moments when folks who were swept up in movements like this felt something like what we mean by collective joy, but we would not want to call that joy. because there's a kind of a normative element to joy as we were talking about it. The other important distinction would be between rejoicing over something and taking pleasure in something. And so there are many things in our culture that we take pleasure in. I would point to kinds of experiences that we have in consuming various things, eating, buying, watching. There's a sense of taking things into ourselves, and we get a sort of a pleasure from that, I suppose. But this is, again, quite different from this sense of plenitude in relationship to our own finitude. Once again, we have the sense of taking the world into us instead of being taken into the world. And so these are both things which, in a way, are kind of false or counterfeit forms of joy that I think we have to be aware of. Not every positive emotional experience is worthy of being called joy.
It's really, I find myself wanting to go in so many different directions. You introduced a lot of really interesting things. Is that the fruit of sociology, having spent a lot of time engaging topics like joy?
Well, as a number of us said during the course of the consultation, I think there's been relatively little explicit attention to joy within the social sciences. You almost have to read some of the texts a little bit against the grain to find it. One place that I would find it is in some of Emil Durkheim's work on what he calls collective effervescence, which is exactly what I was describing as collective joy, the kind of joy you would feel in being part of a social movement or being part of a faith community or being part of a large kin or friendship network. But it's not something which is discussed very much explicitly. Indeed, I think most positive emotions are rarely discussed seriously within the social sciences.
That's interesting. So, why do you think that is? Is it their character as being positive, as you stated it, or at one point in time you mentioned that you would imagine joy having a normative valence or dimension, kind of that would be kind of critical to a right understanding of joy. Mm-hmm. You know, what's the obstacle, or what keeps something like joy from being an object of interest in the social sciences?
Well, for many reasons, social scientists tend to think that they're only being serious when they're talking about things like conflict, power, oppression. It's not to deny the reality of those things, but there's a sort of sense that you haven't really gotten to the bottom of things until you've showed that certain interests were at play or that there was some hidden conflict or so there's always a hermeneutics of suspicion that dominates any sort of a hermeneutics of affirmation in most social scientific work. And so there's a tendency to think that any appeal to love, joy, solidarity, passion, that these things are just masks for something else, for something darker, and that we're only seeing clearly when we see darkly. That certainly is one reason for it. I think there's also another reason, which is that the social sciences want to think of themselves as being objective and value-free, and for whatever reasons, interest, power, desire, utility, these are all things which are seen somehow as being value-free and objective, whereas all of these other positive emotions are seen as not being objective or value-free or even real. So
then, do you, when you think about joy, as we've been talking about it, and its connection, do you see potential connections between a robust understanding of joy, so not a facile or really shallow sense of joy as something that's just feeling good, or being among those who benefit most, from the prizes of their own worlds, But do you see a connection between joy and more of this nitty-gritty world of power and interests? At one point in time, a possible consideration of the relevance of joy for politics came up in our conversation. Is that something you feel like is viable?
I think there definitely is a real connection between moments of collective joy and moments of social transformation. I think here about great social movements and political upheavals. One example would be the American Civil Rights Movement. So many of the photos that you would see are photos involving confrontation, are photos involving conflict, are photos involving struggle, which was, of course, very real, very real. But there is a backstage as well. There were the endless political meetings / church services that would go on for 4 or 5 hours each evening during the course of the Montgomery bus boycott. There was Martin Luther King's late night bull sessions with his so-called kitchen cabinet, playing cards and drinking and smoking around the table, sort of rejuvenating himself for the next morning. And there were also more sublime forms of joy. Think about I have a dream speech on the National Mall in Washington in 1963, where Coretta Scott King later remarks that for just a moment the heavens opened and the kingdom of God descended down to earth, and the sort of moment of joy that came there. Now this, of course, as King himself would have been the first to recognize, these are not themselves the end point of societal transformation, but they're a moment of opening and disclosure and creativity when suddenly people realize that that things don't have to be the way that they are, that there are other possibilities. And of course, it's hard work involved in bringing those about, but it seems to me that probably no amount of hard work in the halls of Congress would have gotten the Civil Rights Act through without moments like the I Have a Dream speech, or for that matter, the inspiring speech that Lyndon Johnson gave before the assembled houses of Congress, right before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So joy can be a kind of epiphanic moment that opens up creativity, possibility, solidarity that didn't seem to be possible before. So I think that it is quite important, and this is one thing which increasingly some social scientists have come to realize, the role of collective emotion in social movements and how important that is.
So this is really fascinating. So if we hypothesize that something like the experience of joy or like that sort of a positive emotion plays a significant role in a variety of significant political or other social events or moments, and there are yet obstacles, within the social sciences to considering those things. What do you imagine as ways forward for a topic that it's, I myself, when I first heard of joy, a joy project had a hard time understanding how I would take that seriously. Do you have ideas about that?
I think there are many possibilities for studying this in a rigorous way. I think, for example, it would be interesting, fascinating to do a comparative study of, say, the role of collective emotion in the civil rights movement and in the Nazi movement, to understand how differently those collective emotions played out, and this might be a way of deepening and advancing our understanding of joy. I think there are also other kinds of contexts in which one could study this as well. Religious movements, different different religious traditions have different understandings of joy, different emphases on joy. There are some that make experiences of joy really quite central. I would think here about Pentecostalism, for example, is one movement for which joy is quite important. But there's also kind of a calm and considered, more individual joyousness that one would find, for example, in certain Buddhist traditions, where much of the practice is about learning to take joy in the most mundane things: washing dishes, pouring tea, sweeping the floor, through the cultivation of a certain kind of attention and discipline of the self.
It seems like there might be possibilities for a topic that is understudied, but has a lot of potential.
Yeah.
Thanks for helping to shine light on those. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.